As a podcast professional, I often get asked by hosts, what should I invest in if I just have some cash? Or what should I prioritize? Or what is the thing that's going to give me the biggest ROI? And of course, every situation for every person, it's different. They have different needs, they have different goals. But what I will cover in this episode is what's true for most small business owners and why they matter. But if you're ready to find out, this short episode is going to provide you all the actionable tips, what to think about. And at the end of the episode, stick around because I'm going to provide you with a few extra resources. And so if you're ready to find out what are the top 3 things that you should be focusing on first to grow your podcast, if you're tired of wasting time, this episode is for you. I'm Anna Xavier, I'm a podcast strategist, and this is the Podcast Space, a podcast that will help elevate your podcast while get you unstuck. Let's go. All right, this is going to be such a quick episode because I know that you're wasting time, you're wasting energy, and you could be actually wasting money. So after this episode is done, I really want you to let me know your ahas and if you were surprised by these top 3. And if you're wanting to see growth, 1000% you need this episode because so many podcasters I talk to, they say, I can do it all. And I'm like, sure, great. But because you can do it all, it doesn't mean that you have to do it all. I do that often too. I used to, when I didn't like writing newsletters, I got people to write newsletters for me because I was just so stuck. I could write them, but I take forever and double guess myself. It was a whole thing. And then eventually I got to the point where I could do them myself. And I did. Let's start with number 3. Number 3 is social media. And you're ready. Please do not stop playing because you're like, Anna, really, social media? Yeah. So most podcasters, and you probably do too, dread social media. It's just like, they get the sweats. They're like, I hate doing this. I don't like it. I don't understand. And you're probably doing either the bare minimum or you're doing the classic posting and ghosting. You're not hanging out for conversations. You are not commenting back. And that is actually hurting your podcast because I want you to consider this. You are already having a monologue on your podcast. You already are not receiving feedback. And social media is one of the few places that you can actually do that. But just because you don't like it, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't delegate it to someone else. And so if you are thinking about, I really want to receive more feedback on my audience and I want to know what they're thinking, a good way to do that is to start being more present intentionally on social media. So you can pay someone to just create content and schedule it for you, write captions, whatever it is. And you focus on actually just engaging with people on the DMs, maybe creating Insta stories where you're just going about your day and it's kind of like more raw and imperfect. But you don't have that pressure to show up on the feed and create perfect, quote unquote, perfect posts. You don't have to do any of that. Especially with AI, honestly, if you're thinking that you can be asked with creating content, you could be paying a small fee to get access to a software. They will cut things for you, or multiple podcast platforms already do that as well, have an integration that will allow you to seamlessly do that. But I mean, to know exactly the type of content that converts, it's important. And actually have a short course that it's called Beyond the Trends. And it kind of explains how to create content that is going to get you engagement, but also some alternatives that won't get you dancing or doing, weird things. Because I know that as podcasters, we feel like promoting the podcast, promoting those conversations, promoting what's been said is the last thing that we want to do at the end of the day when we're so tired, right? So that is like an hour course. It's super easy. I'll put the link below. I got so much good feedback on that. Like people were like, oh my gosh, like I didn't realize that I didn't need to spend that much time actually creating content. And I was like, So you can do that. You can also hire people to run 1 to 2 channels at a time. You can run something from, I know that there's packages from like $200 to, $1,500 depending on what it is that you need. So I know that if you have money to spare, that's something that it is a pain point for podcasters. I know people don't like doing it. So if that's something that is like preventing you from showing up at all, do it. And also there's this misconception that you will grow your podcast on social media. you won't grow your podcast as fast as you think if you're just posting one image that is new episode is out, right? Like that is not teasing anyone to do anything at all. So be aware of not just what you're putting out there, what the intent is, and what is the experience for the listener. So are you making something that is like really teasing the episode and they cannot help themselves but listen, right? Moving on to number 2, editing. Yep. This probably, you guessed it, right? You probably even thought that editing was number 1. I'll get to that. But I want you to consider, if you've been holding off, again, that same mindset, I can edit, it's no big deal. But how do you feel after finishing the edit? Do you feel exhausted and burnt out and you just like you can't hear yourself anymore? Some people hate the sound of their voice so much that they re-record multiple episodes. I want you to consider, how much do you charge an hour? And if you charge an hour, an amount that is considerably high, or at least more than, $100 an hour. And if you are spending more than 3 hours editing, you're not saving money. You are wasting $300 per episode, because you could be focusing that time into high value tasks. So for instance, things that no one else can do, like for instance, writing the outline for your upcoming episode or doing outreach to listeners who did reach out. So those things are more exciting to you. Yeah, absolutely do them. And especially if someone can edit a podcast way faster than you, to the quality, to the standard that you can't, that's another one. If you are spending too much time fixing the audio, or you're just like have no idea what you're doing, just hire that out, or do a bartering, or get an intern and teach them. And I'm not a fan of like unpaid internships, but if someone really wants to learn everything about you and your business, it's sometimes worthwhile doing. So just make sure that you're not taking advantage of the person. And so talking about like why this is important, why is it important to obviously, create good content? It's because people do judge you for the quality of the content you put out. And if your expertise is in the content itself and it's sounding terrible, and again, people won't judge you if you have like a microphone that is decent. They won't judge you for, saying a few ums and ahs, but they will judge you if the quality of the podcast really sucks, right? Like if the audio quality is all over the place, the levels are all over the place, if it's an unpleasant experience in listening to the podcast, that's something that you should invest in right away, especially if you are a professional who wants to create meaningful content for thought leadership or network with decision makers. That's important to know. But also like get your energy back. I work with a client that they kept insisting on editing every single episode, and we had a meeting about like why they were not excited about the podcast anymore. It just came down to they were obsessing over the fact that they were the only ones that could edit to their taste. When in fact, when they did hire out, eventually I was like, hey, just try it. Just hire someone just to see if they can do a good job. And that person was just so blown away. They're like, wow, like I didn't end up the week feeling exhausted. And I actually spent time talking to more leads or whatever it was that they were doing. And I was like, yes, you don't need to do all the things. And if you teach someone how to do it in your style, especially if your podcast has been out enough for a while, like you can do a good job of just saying, hey, listen to this, try to edit as closely as this. Not all podcasts are that special in the sense of like someone can come in, someone can learn your style. It's not impossible to learn what you're doing. And it's possible that they even do a better job at it than you, or learn it faster because that's their skill set. And so many podcasters, probably yourself included, you're like, I can edit. And it's like, well, but how excited would you be to not have that on your plate? If you love editing, that's one thing. I, for instance, as soon as I can offset like editing to someone else, I'll probably will. So again, the podcast is supposed to be a tool for your business, and like anything else you would make a decision about, is this cost efficient or not? But also, could I be doing things differently in my business if I didn't have the time to edit? Because editing is one of the biggest time sucks for podcasters. And this is number one. We're getting to number one, and that is to determine your content strategy. And here's why. You're thinking, Anna, I would think that editing was number one, but it isn't. And here's why. Because most podcasters, maybe you are wasting time, energy, and money on creating content that I would say probably 70% of times is not aligned with your goals. You're creating content, you may be getting feedback, but it's not doing anything for your business. And so I think that knowing and determining exactly what your goal with the podcast is, what type of content you need to be creating, with that content itself, right? All of this, once it happens once, you can get ahead, and instead of spending, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and then thinking, well, now I have content, now I can go and focus on content strategy. Well, you've wasted so much time and energy, and you could have gotten the results maybe in 3 months. Of course, again, every situation is different, but I had so many clients that they waited until, quote unquote, they had, the download numbers they thought they needed to create, leads for their business, or create impact through their community, or get speaking gigs, when in fact they could have done that from day one. And that's why I'm saying creating content that is not aligned with your goals is gonna waste you time, but also you're gonna be burnt out. And this isn't about build it and they will come, because that is not true with podcasting. Podcasting itself is one of the platforms that has the lowest discoverability rate. So it's not that like anyone picks up the phone, goes on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and thinks, let me listen to this random podcast. That is not how people behave. So knowing exactly the type of content, maximizing the listeners you already have so they do the work for you, or maximizing the guests in front of you, that is what you will and should invest first in your business, because it will be the difference between you achieving your goals or burning out. This happened a few times already, which is so disappointing, because clients would book in, podcast power hours, just 1 hour. We go through their questions, we realign whatever is wrong, or we just adjust whatever it is kind of like not helping them in their plan. And then I honestly, 20% of the clients that book a podcast power hour too late with me, they never have the energy to implement anything. So they actually stop podcasting, which to me, it's super disappointing, because I'm thinking you have all the answers, but you have no energy to implement because you've already been dragging your feet for all these months. And, maybe you tried growing the podcast and it didn't work, or maybe you just spent all of these money on creating the perfect, most beautiful edited podcast, and the content itself is not doing anything for you. So I think that I'm kind of going through the same things, but I want to let you know that, you're throwing money away when you have no idea what the podcast goal is. And so it isn't just saying my goal is getting leads. A good strategist will get you down the road of knowing exactly what are you talking about, what platforms this is going to be on, which platforms are the best for optimizing the content itself. How are you promoting the podcast? In which ways are you underutilizing the podcast? Looking at the metrics and the analytics. What is performing really well? What hasn't been created? What opportunities are you missing, right? Is this still aligned with your initial goal? Because sometimes goals change. But also, what is the strategy that empowers you to make better decisions to grow your podcast, that doesn't overwhelm you, but also that works with your strengths? So instead of creating a podcast that is perfect and this is the expression that I hate, follow my plan, it will work for anyone. That's not the case, because if you are someone who likes a lot of structure and is very methodical, you're going to be really different from someone who likes the spur of the moment, who's very creative. Those are different needs, and those have to be catered to differently. So for instance, a client that I was working with, they said, there's this spike in the downloads, and we don't really know why this is happening. We're not really doing anything. We just see the spike. We can't understand what's happening. And I just said, hey, what day is this? And they were, Wednesday, whatever. And I was like, what do you do on Wednesdays? They're like, we sent out a newsletter. Their face, it was priceless. I still have it etched in my brain because it was one of those things that I knew obviously that there had to be like a task they were doing every week, but they didn't even think to connect the dots like that. They didn't realize. And so to me, again, a strategist will help you realize if like these tasks that you're doing are really worthwhile in getting into the end goal or not. But again, also because when we're working by ourselves, we tend to go into what is comfortable, right? Or we end up talking about the things we're most comfortable about, right? So sometimes the content can start sounding the same, or we're missing out on like a little tweak that, for instance, instead of talking about a service, but talking about a client story will be so different than just talking about, hey, I do this. It's like, what is the real life scenario that you've worked on this, right? Like it will be completely different. But when we're creating content, we're sometimes too close to the content to really like kind of, sift through the ideas. But sometimes there are like those connecting dots in between two episodes that need to be addressed. And when we're too close to it, we don't see it. But also sometimes we are in denial. We say, my podcast is doing fine. And when you know that your podcast has more potential, but you just don't know what to do. So you're just saying, my podcast is doing great, when in fact, there's so much more to be achieved. And so sometimes starting projects, and we all know that podcasting is like a marathon. And so if you're creating content, but you're not having any juice to do everything else, maybe it's because you're overcomplicating the whole process. Like for instance, a client that they had like 3 segments on their show and they really dreaded, like the segment didn't flow mentally. They had been doing like 30 episodes and it still wasn't working. And so they were insisting on that thing because they were just like, that's how I think a podcast should go. And when we talked about it, I was like, hey, I don't think this is flowing. And they're like, I don't like it either. I'm like, why are you doing it? And they had like these preconceived notions of that's how a podcast should be. And so they were just like, they didn't feel excited about this transition. They always messed it up. It added additional work to edit. And so we're like, let's just like drop this. Maybe we don't have a sound effect. Maybe you only do that when it makes sense, like twice a month, or you pre-plan. So in order for the conversation to flow better, you can actually do that, close that segment and move on to the next one. And these are things that, again, we don't know what we don't know, right? We have to be curious about what we are not understanding about ourselves as well. And hiring someone else has that like bird's eye view of what's happening, but also they can see strengths in you that maybe you can't see it yourself. So these are the 3 things that I think that you should be investing in once you do have the capabilities to invest, or just find a way to get someone to do that work for you. So number 3 is finding someone to do the social media for you, because I know that is a huge pain point for podcasters and it will help you connect deeper with your audience. Number 2 is editing that podcast so you're not wasting your precious time on a low value task, which is removing ahs and uhs and equalizing the file and making sure that, everybody is at the same level. And number 1, the thing that I think you should be investing right away is a podcast strategist. Don't just publish and hope for the best. Don't publish and hope they will come. Know exactly the type of content that you need to be creating in order to achieve your goals. So, were you surprised by these top 3? Let me know on the Instagrams. I'm at The Podcast Space. And obviously thepodcastspace.com/podcast is where you can find all the resources mentioned in this podcast. But also, I want to invite you to talk to me, because I always talk to podcasts from all different industries, and we always find a way to get better processes for them to help them in their podcast journey to get to their podcast goals faster. I'm more than happy to work with you. Plus, it will be fun. Working with someone else on podcast content is always fun. So I promise you that it won't be cringe town. You won't be like face palming and saying, oh my God, like I have not done this. I promise you that it will be fine. All right. I'm Anna Xavier, and this is The Podcast Space, a podcast that is practical and is designed to elevate your podcast journey, but also get you unstuck. I'll see you in the next episode.